It's 2026, and Ford made an unexpected decision about its famous 10-speed transmission. Praised by some drivers and heavily criticized by others, it's now being quietly reshaped instead of replaced. So what's really changing inside this gearbox, and why did people hate it in the first place? Before we answer that, we need to understand what Ford's 10-speed actually is. Ford's 10-speed automatic transmission, officially called the 10R80, was co-developed by Ford and General Motors and introduced around 2017 across trucks and performance vehicles like the F-150, Mustang, Expedition, Ranger, and Bronco. At its core, the idea was simple. More gears give the engine more control. Instead of jumping between big RPM gaps like older 6-speed automatics, the 10-speed keeps the engine closer to its ideal power and efficiency range. That means better fuel economy, quicker acceleration, and stronger towing performance without making the engine work harder than it needs to. The hardware itself is solid. The transmission uses multiple clutch packs, planetary gear sets, and adaptive learning software to decide when and how to shift. On paper, it's one of the most advanced automatics Ford has ever put into mass-market vehicles. But advanced doesn't always mean smooth. So why did Ford move away from the trusted 6-speed and jump all the way to 10 gears? And why did so many drivers end up complaining about how it actually feels to drive? Compared to a 6-speed, a 10-speed keeps RPM drops smaller between shifts. That lets the engine stay in its power band, improving acceleration and efficiency at the same time. In theory, more gears mean the transmission doesn't have to work as hard. It can cruise in lower RPMs, tow with better control, and respond faster when you hit the throttle. But the trade-off is complexity. With 10 ratios to choose from, the software has to constantly decide what gear you should be in. If that logic becomes too aggressive, the transmission starts hunting, overshifting, or reacting when the driver didn't ask for it. The 10-speed wasn't built wrong, it was built too smart, and that personality is exactly what Ford is now changing. Now, if the hardware was strong, what actually went wrong? When Ford rolled the 10-speed into real-world trucks and performance cars, expectations were high. Even though it promised better mileage, faster response, and smoother towing, daily drivers don't live on spec sheets. They live in traffic, parking lots, stoplights, and half-throttle cruising. And that's where frustration started. Instead of feeling natural, many owners reported the transmission behaving unpredictably. Owners' complaints started stacking up across F-100s, Mustangs, Expeditions, Rangers, and Broncos. Not because the transmission was breaking, but because it felt like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. And there were so many issues that made the 10-speed feel awkward when most drivers weren't even pushing their trucks hard. The first issue was gear hunting. With 10 ratios available, the software constantly searched for the perfect gear instead of staying in a good one. At light throttle, the transmission would bounce between gears trying to maximize efficiency. That sounds smart, but in practice it felt nervous. Drivers experienced extra shifts, hesitation when merging, and sudden downshifts that didn't match pedal input. Ford designed the system to adapt to driver habits, but early calibrations reacted too quickly to tiny changes in throttle, speed, and load. Instead of smoothing motion, the logic kept correcting itself. It was like a driver constantly changing lanes because one lane looked slightly faster. Then the second issue was engagement timing and clutch behavior. In a multi-gear automatic, every shift depends on clutch packs applying and releasing at precise moments. When the software commands change too aggressively, those clutches engage faster than the vehicle's motion expects. The result? Overly firm upshifts, delayed engagement when shifting into drive or reverse, and occasional thumps during low-speed driving. Ford even issued multiple technical service bulletins over the years, addressing rough shifts, hesitation, and reprogramming needs for the 10R80. And it was all because the calibration didn't match human driving rhythm. The backlash wasn't about durability, it was about trust. And once a transmission feels unpredictable, reputation spreads faster than any spec sheet ever could. By the time backlash around the 10-speed started spreading, many people assumed Ford would scrap it and start fresh. But that never happened. Instead of pulling the plug, Ford doubled down. That wasn't stubbornness. It was a strategy. And for that strategy, Ford had to ask something more important. Was the 10-speed actually failing? And even if it was, could Ford realistically abandon it at all? But before we go deeper into why Ford chose to fix its personality instead of replacing its bones, take a second to hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because the real story behind modern cars usually lives behind the curtain. Now back to where we left. Inside the hardware, the answer leans towards stability, not collapse. The 10R80 uses multi-plate clutch packs built for high-torque loads, planetary gear sets shared across truck and performance platforms, and a torque converter designed for towing, boost, and heavy use. In large-scale durability testing and field data, the transmission wasn't catastrophically breaking across the fleet. What owners felt was behavioral mismatch, the way the transmission reacted to humans, not the way it survived physics. But the bigger reason Ford couldn't walk away was integration itself. Because the same 10-speed architecture lives across Ford's lineup, from the F-150 and Expedition to the Mustang Bronco and Super Duty derivatives. So replacing it wouldn't mean changing one part. It would mean redesigning mounting points, control modules, cooling strategies, and powertrain logic across millions of vehicles. And then there's hybridization. Ford's Power Boost system relies on the 10-speed structure to blend electric torque with engine output during gear changes. A brand new transmission would require rewriting how motors, engines, and shifts communicate. A multi-year ecosystem reset, not a simple upgrade. So Ford didn't see the 10-speed as a mistake. They saw it as infrastructure that had to grow up and chose to fix its personality. And when I say fixing, it's about the transmission's brain. Earlier versions of the 10R80 relied on extremely aggressive adaptive logic. The control module watched throttle position, vehicle speed, road grade, steering input, braking pressure, load, and driver history, then constantly recalculated what gear it thought you might want next. That sounds really advanced, but in reality, it made the transmission restless. This is where Ford shifted everything. So how exactly did Ford calm a transmission that was built to think too fast? The core change is gear strategy consolidation. Instead of walking through multiple ratios under light throttle, the updated logic skips unnecessary steps. That makes the 10-speed behave more like a refined 6 or 8 speed, even though all 10 ratios remain available when needed. Technically, this reduces clutch cycling inside the transmission. Each shift requires hydraulic pressure changes, clutch engagement, and release timing. When shifts happen constantly, heat builds inside the clutch packs and valve body. By lowering shift frequency, Ford cuts internal friction, reduces oil temperature spikes, and minimizes mechanical shock across the gear train. And another major change is what engineers call overcorrection logic. Earlier software constantly second-guessed itself. A slight lift of the throttle could trigger a downshift, and a tiny reapply would trigger an upshift. That back-and-forth behavior is what created the famous gear hunting sensation many drivers complained about. The updated decision tree listens more to steady-state inputs instead of micro-movements. The result is smoother acceleration, cleaner deceleration, and far fewer surprise shifts when your foot isn't actually asking for one. But smoothing daily driving is easy. The real test for any truck transmission is load. So how does this new logic behave when a trailer is actually pulling back? From the start, towing was one of Ford's highest priorities in the redesign. Before, the 10-speed aggressively searched for the perfect efficiency window while hauling. It caused frequent downshifts, upshifts, and converter activity under sustained load, and it felt unstable when a trailer was attached. Now, since the transmission is allowed to settle, it locks into fewer, stronger gears and holds them longer. That stabilizes engine speed, reduces heat buildup in the torquey converter, and limits repeated clutch engagement under stress. Also, on Power Boost hybrid models, electric torque plays an even bigger role. The motor supplies instant force between shifts, reducing the need for constant downshifting. When electric torque fills the gap, mechanical parts don't have to scramble to compensate for lost momentum. It creates fewer shifts, lower heat, and less internal wear, all pointing toward the same outcome. And because of this, the 10-speed works calmly, deliberately, and mechanically healthier for the long run. And now let's talk about reliability. the thing people care about most once the excitement fades. The earlier 10-speed didn't struggle because its parts were weak. The problems usually came from stress, like too many shifts, heat, and clutch events during normal driving. Over time, constant motion turns small wear into real damage. With the calmer behavior coming into the next generation, the 10-speed finally gets to operate like a machine instead of a nervous prediction system. After all these changes in strategy and control, what should drivers actually expect from Ford's 10-speed moving forward? At this point, longer life doesn't come from magic upgrades. It comes from reduced workload. Holding gears longer lowers how often clutches engage, which keeps heat and pressure under control. Cooler fluid protects seals and internal parts instead of cooking them over time, and smarter locking during load limits converter slip, which also keeps temperature stable. In the end, the result is simple. The transmission stops rushing and starts working steadily. Still, keep your expectations in their lane. You don't know how it's going to end up because in the real world, controlled behavior is what separates a gearbox that fades early from one that keeps working quietly for years. So what do you think? Would you rather have a transmission that feels fast or one that feels predictable? And if you were buying a Ford today, would these changes actually influence your decision? Drop your thoughts below. I read them all.